Hello, everyone. This is at Mr. Ibida Alex Chezik.
And this is Shimon Lazarov at Shimon Lazarov.
And today, get your Fedora hats on, get your bling and razzle dazzle, hide your liquor because we're going back to the roaring 20s, baby. Welcome to the Hardcore Finance Podcast.
So, Alex, we had this idea of we're in the 2020s right now, and the Roaring 20s, the 1920s, was a very interesting time financially. And there are many things that are similar between now and then. So we thought to make an episode about that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. The parallels are pretty uncanny if you think about it. And I think we should discuss both how they're similar and then how they're different. And then we should, attempt to make a call on the future. We all know that the roaring 20s of 1920 ended with the crash, the Wall Street crash, Black Friday in 1929, and then led into World War II. So hopefully history doesn't fully repeat itself and we don't go into a bubble and a crash and a world war, but who knows? And let's discuss those possibilities at the end.
Exactly. So basically, after looking at what's similar and what's different, we can look at where's a good place to put your money now, given those similarities. I will just point an anecdote that even though there was a crash, if someone would have invested a lot of money in the stock market in, let's say, 1920 and held it until the 1960s or 70s, they would have made a fortune. So that's what we'll examine about where to invest our money going forward. But so let's start with why are those things similar? It's actually it struck me that it's very interesting. So, first of all, in both cases, we had a big crisis, a big global crisis. So in 1920, we were just coming back from World War I, which was a crazy, took a crazy toll on human life, destroyed a crazy amount of capital. And, it was just like a huge, huge shock to the economy after what people called the Belle Epoque, which is what came before World War I, which was pretty much like a golden age in Europe. Like people were inventing industrialization and electricity and had all these world fairs. And it was almost like a peak for humanity. And then this terrible calamity happened. And if you think about the coronavirus that happened just now, if you look at 2019, technology was booming, many things were booming, and then suddenly people were locked down in their houses. So this is like a very interesting parallel. And then quickly, the other two things that are similar are that in 1920, the stock market actually did really, really well in the US. Compared to the previous years and the years after. So even though World War I took a huge toll, stock market did really well and you could have made a lot of money. And then the third thing was the rise of socialism. So we know that in Russia the communist revolution happened, the Bolshevik revolution. In Weimar Germany, they printed a lot of money after World War I to pay off the debts to the rest of Europe and also do social programs. So it's a very interesting parallel to modern monetary theory and all the other people that now call for socialism in one form or another.
These are great and uncanny parallels. Before we move on, can you tell our listeners a little bit about what does modern monetary theory mean for those who don't know? We don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but I think it'll be good to give a quick refresh.
So modern monetary theory is a left-wing theory of economy, which basically says, look, since the government, and it's very US-centric, but basically since the US creates its currency, anything that they can pay for with US dollars, they shouldn't be limited by deficits. They can just like print money and use that money to give it to people. And, it didn't end well for the Weimar Republic in Germany. They printed so much money that at some point you had to take a wheelbarrow full of bills to buy a loaf of bread.
It must have been one great loaf of bread. But all jokes aside, thank you for that explanation. Let's go back to point number one. We're coming out of a major world crisis again in Europe and in the rest of the the center of the world at that point. From an economic perspective, we've had World War I is just coming to an end. Again, massive toll on human life, massive destruction across Europe, and now we have the coronavirus, which literally in March and April stopped the world dead in its tracks. More than 30 to 40% drop in GDPs or economic drop across different countries, Europe, US specifically, but really across the world. Brazil is getting hit, has gotten hit. India and Russia are now getting hit just as hard, and of course China, where the virus originated. But Shimon, let's talk about this a little bit. Do how can you equate the two? Are they similar? Are they not? Obviously, the destruction that they've caused is different. One is actual lives lost from actual fighting. One is lives lost from the virus. But do you equate the two? Are these two catastrophes similar for you in terms of setting up the economic environment that's going to follow it?
I mean, they're similar in principle. I don't know about orders of magnitude because I'm not an historian. I mean, clearly more people died in World War One than from the coronavirus, and also it was very different type of people. So in World War One, people died when they're young, which means that you lose more productivity and more kind of human years lost. But they were similar in the sense that everything was going pretty well before that, and especially on the technological front. If you look, I mean, we take those things for granted, but like in the 1900s, Europe was being electrified. The Industrial Revolution was at its peak. Cars were being invented. The plane was being invented. Like it was a huge technological boom. The radio. So in that sense, it's kind of similar, where everything was kind of going really well, and then suddenly an event that was pretty much not an economic event just like stopped the GDP growth and reversed it. So in that sense, they're similar.
I think you bring up a very interesting point, which is not to be shouldn't be overlooked. In Europe during World War One, the people that were killed were young people, right? These are the people that were going to live, reproduce, cause a lot of or benefit or contribute rather to a lot of productivity across the world and across their countries. Versus the coronavirus is more targeting the elderly and the frail. And I think from a macro perspective, every death is obviously horrible. But from a macroeconomic perspective, it's easier to recover when you have the young force going back into the job market, assuming that their jobs still exist, of course, assuming everything else being equal. Then, if you have the young people being taken out. So, I think as we think about the latter part of the podcast and we think about what's going to happen now versus, 1920s, this is a key point, and I love the fact that you brought it up, that we should consider in terms of who's coming back into the workforce and can productivity rebound or not. And I think one of the things that we should evaluate really the stock market and economy around is this, productivity. The stock market is going to go up because of actual underlying real factors, real drivers like productivity, economic booms, and so on, or exuberance. So as we tease out the increase in the stock market in the 1920s versus the 2020s, we should talk about whether it's driven by a real force or by exuberance. And I think that will help us prognose or project what's going to ultimately happen at the end of the decade.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I want to add another theme before we transition to the stock market and why it boomed in both cases, which is the fact that back then, right in the 1920s, all the world was on a gold standard, and I don't know if people appreciate how interesting that thing is. So there was no such thing as a currency exchange rate between two countries. Every country had an exchange rate against gold, and that exchange rate was pretty much fixed. And for whoever doesn't understand it, so for example, the pound sterling was 1 pound of sterling silver. That was literally the definition. It's a note that you could take to the central bank of England and get a pound of sterling silver. And so what happened is you could pretty much have universal prices, right? So like one product would kind of cost you the same everywhere. Of course, you had shipping costs and stuff like that, but there was no such thing as one country devaluing its currency, because what happened is if one country would devalue its currency, then people would just redeem it for silver, and then the silver would leave the country, or the gold would leave the country, and then they would kind of go bankrupt, and they would have to, like, increase the value of the currency again. So it was a check on governments. Now, some people say this was really bad because it basically made the depression much last much longer than it needed to last. I actually think that it was a very good thing. And then if the government could print, like if FDR could print a lot of money back then, the depression would have been much worse. But there's definitely not a consensus among academics in this. But I just want to point out, so back then you had a gold standard, which means you cannot just print money. Now you saw what the governments did. So the governments just like globally increased the money supply by like 30% in less than a year, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Do you think that has anything to do with the fact that the stock market rebounded really quickly now, or what do you think are the implications of that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So let's move over to the stock market. And before I answer your question, let's again set the stage. I think we should evaluate it from, again, underlying drivers, quantitative easing, which is of course happening now and not so much back then, but we can talk about other financial innovations that drove the market of 1920s, and underlying value drivers. So let me opine on the stock market of today. I think there are two or three things that are causing the market to increase. One is this continued technological innovation that's gone on before, actually today, before 2020. It's gone on for the last 5 or 7 years, and it's really kind of booming and driving the economy forward. A lot of that is digital transformation. So companies are using technology to transform themselves, to become more efficient, to deliver better services. The rise of communications through 4G brought, connections to various endpoints to your phone so you can stream video. It gave the rise of the gig economy, gave the rise to the Ubers of the world, to the Instacarts of the world, and to the streaming content providers of the world, the Netflixes and so on and so forth. We shouldn't undermine what 4G, the telecommunications infrastructure, has done to digitize the world. So there's been a lot of underlying value drivers that have been driving the economy forward. Secondly, we've done a lot of printing, as you talked about, money printing. And so especially in the last 12 months, 30 to 40%, I don't remember the exact statistic, but something around 30, 40% of the current money circulated in the US has been printed in the last 12 months. That's an exceptionally high amount. And that created inflation in capital goods, inflation in real estate, Bitcoin, the stock market. And because people were saving money, they're just so afraid of the coronavirus and what it was going to do. They were afraid their jobs weren't going to come back. They were saving money, they weren't consuming it. So capital savings goods, savings instruments increased. So those two factors, right, an ongoing momentum plus printing of money, help the stock market recover really, really quickly, even when the underlying economy is not as strong. We're talking today, this is December 27th. Recently, the unemployment numbers came up pretty high. The consumer spending over the holidays came up, was underwhelming and under expectations. So the U.S. recovery has hit a plateau, yet the market and the NASDAQ and the S&P keep on setting new highs. Why? Again, underlying momentum, but a lot of quantitative easing and money printing that's going back into the market and causing inflation there. Is this how you see it as well, Shimon?
Yeah, that's how I see it. And I'm just reading now from an article from thebalance.com called The Roaring Twenties. It is so similar. So I'll just read verbatim from the article. It says, in the 1920s, the economy grew by 42%, the US economy. The United States produced almost half of the world's output because World War I destroyed most of Europe. New construction almost doubled. Okay, it's just insane. Unemployment in the 1920s never rose above the natural rate of 4%. Per capita GDP rose by like 50%, and GDP per person. And then this prosperity was not distributed evenly. So in 1922, the top 1% of the population received 13% of the total income. By 1929, it earned 14.5%. So think of the top 1%. People are talking now about like, the 1% and income inequality. So 1920s, right? It's exactly the same picture. And what they say here is basically it's because the United States transformed from a traditional to a free market economy, farming declined from like 18% to 12%. So this is everything that you're talking about, the 4G and the digitalization of everything. It's just like basically improvements in productivity, and very very similar. So if listeners want to listen to our previous episode about like can the stock market keep breaking all-time highs while unemployment keeps high at like 30%, it's basically a productivity play. So we machines do more of the work, and the side effect of that productivity is income inequality, because what happens is that if you own capital, if you own very sophisticated capital, you can capture a lot of that surplus. And so those, it's just crazy how similar it is.
So it's interesting. There's another similarity, although I think it's actually been exacerbated more, and why it caused more of a shock to the system in the 1920s, though, and will now, is that there was a lot of financial engineering. And so if we think about uh, the current market, and if we rewind about 10 years back to the bubble that popped in 2008,
Mm-hmm.
what popped in 2008 is CDOs, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
essentially the banks were taking debt, collateralized debt, so debt against houses and mortgages, putting them together and securitizing them, so selling them on the market. So people can go, I can go and buy, New York real estate. They're called REITs or other financial instruments. Typically, you have a mix of good debt and bad debt. So credit worthy creditors, if you will, and not. But what the banks did in order to get more and more pension fund money is that they said, okay, we're going to take a layer, we're going to combine these instruments in such a way to give them AAA or AA ratings. We're essentially going to take the best of the best and put them together. Then from the rest, we'll take the best from the rest. And so what ended up happening is the banks had a lot of hidden really, really poor debt on their balance sheets. And when that
Mm-hmm.
debt, when the economy kind of overheated, the debt came due and people couldn't pay, and a lot of houses went under, the balance sheets popped. And the reason why I say this is because in the 1920s, one of the biggest reasons why the market went up is because they created and they let people buy stocks on margin. And so people weren't ready for margin calls. So what's buying stocks on margin? You essentially borrow money in order to. So I borrow $100 and I have 10 of my own, and I buy $110 worth of stock, but I only put 10 of my own in. If the stock decreases and falls, from 110 down, let's say to 100, well, I lost my 10. I still owe that 100 back. If it fell to 90, I'm way under, right? So it feels like it lost 20%, 110 to 90, but actually my money is completely gone. Plus, I'll double what I essentially invested. And so in the 1920s, this financial new instrument innovation came out, and so a lot of people started buying stocks on margin.
Mm-hmm.
Secondarily, banks' actual cash reserves, when there was the run on the banks, there was no cash. They were essentially lending out all the money that they had, and they kept frivolous or very 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 little cash reserves on hand. And so there was a lot of financial gimmicks that we learned somewhat of it in 2008, and we've had that pain. So there have been changes in the system, although not as many as we would like, but the system is different. And especially when we look at the banks, JP Morgan, for example, when the coronavirus came out, there was an article by Jamie Dimon a few days ago when he said his goal was to build a bulletproof balance sheet. That if something like 2008 happens again, the banks will be able to withstand the black swan event. Excuse me, a black swan event being something that's extremely unlikely. And so we have a fundamentally different structure right now that didn't exist, a banking structure right now that didn't exist in the 1920s, that I think will actually hold us through in case another shock happens.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a very good point. The idea also that the governments could print money and backstop the those shocks. I think not only is it a tool that exists now, but that tool was used big time in March of 2020. So I think basically the banks really learned their lesson. And again, we could argue whether this is good or bad, but like they definitely learned their lesson from 2008, where the intervention wasn't strong enough, and it was more of a like three stage, QE1, QE2, QE3. Here it was more of a shock and awe situation of like, oh, the market fell sharply, we're just going to flood it with dollars. And yeah, it rebounded, what people call the V-shaped recovery, which was only on financial assets. But the price of that was huge income inequality, because basically what happened is if you owned any financial assets, you basically made a lot of money from the coronavirus. And if you and you know again, our listeners can go back to the episodes we recorded as this was happening, and this was exactly our prediction, which is like the governments will not let this happen. And so if you are heavily invested in the stock market, you will benefit from it. The only thing that matters is to not get a margin call, so to not get wiped out, so like not to use leverage in a way that could like jeopardize the whole portfolio. But we'll talk more about that in our recommendations at the end of this episode. But basically, yeah, to your point, we have become much better at managing the economy, and specifically the stock market, when crises hit. Do you want to talk about the income inequality and its implications? Because
Yes.
I think
So
this is going to be a huge theme in the next 10 years.
yeah, I think it's a great segue. And just a quick touch, QE1 and QE2, when Shimon mentioned it, it's quantitative easing. So rounds of quantitative easing, essentially the government printing money in order to help us withstand the shock, giving checks to people.
It wasn't giving checks to people, it was basically buying mortgage-backed securities. But it's the same thing essentially, because like if you owned a mortgage, if the government wouldn't have bought these mortgage-backed securities, the price of homes would have fell much more than it actually did. So it basically was giving money to homeowners, is
That
what happened in 2008.
That's right. I for some reason thought you were talking about now, but yes, 2008 was the government buying securities, as you mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about income inequality, because I think this is a biggie. And so let's rewind to the 1920s. You have a lot of inequality not only in the U.S. but also around the world, especially in Germany. So after World War One, the basically the European nations carved up the the lands and influence over Germany. The German people were in destitute, without not to mince words here, and this contributed to the rise of Hitler. And Hitler wanted to reclaim Germany's kind of right in the European pecking order. He wanted to bring in a better economy and stronger, better lives for the German people. And this is a lot of reasons why people kind of actually voted for him or believed in him. And so we have very similar pain points that are going on around the world now. And my thesis has always been that when you have major pain and you have income inequality across the world, inevitably these things spill over, and neither they spill over into some sort of social unrest or violence. Hopefully, they don't spill over into war. And we should talk about when we talk about how the 1920 is different than 2020. We will talk about war and weaponry. But social unrest causes people to want to burn down the house. And so we're seeing in the US the whole Trump movement of wanting to burn down the house and get rid of Congress and start anew. This is what Trumpism was all about in the 1920s in Europe and in the USSR, well, in Russia then, in the USSR. The Bolsheviks wanted to burn down the house and literally did, to bring in socialism and then communism because of the way that Tsar was mistreating its people. And this, by the way, happened across Europe. The conversion from Russia to USSR was the biggest, obviously, but across England and Germany and the Nazi Party is a socialist party. Socialism was a huge there was a huge rise of socialism because people were blaming the current system and the social unrest was boiling over. And so let's look at what's happening in the world now. There's a lot of calls for socialism across the world. There are definitely calls of socialism in the US. I never thought I would live to the day to hear in the US a party or a major candidate for presidency call himself a democratic socialist and have a lot of people very educated, and actually people from the ex-Soviet Union follow him and support him and say yes, socialism is good. When time and time again this experiment has failed, remarkably has failed, and so we're seeing the same unaddressed pain points within the fabric of the social system: the income inequality, the rising inequality between the top 1% and everyone else, the ability to get to certain levels in society in the US, the ability to climb the ladder to reach the American dream, which is causing this unrest. And this, I think you and I will both agree, is a big is this big uh, I would say in my case, kind of evil, negative headwind that can cause our system to actually. This is what I'm afraid of. I guess this is what's keeping me up at night. If I'm thinking what's going to cause the stock market to pop or to not endure for a long period of time, it's the rise of pure and true socialism and the credence of it in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think that the idea is that basically some utopians think that socialism was something that was just ahead of its time. So there's some people that say, look, socialism is easy to achieve when you have an abundance of consumer goods. So, if you have, very cheap energy, that's the US currently has very cheap energy because it's energy kind of independent, and you have robotics and mechanization that can make all these goods, then it's much more viable to have some sort of universal basic income, which is pretty much communism, right? Like, what is communism? It's like everybody gets according to like their needs, which basically means universal basic income. So some utopians think you can actually do this, and you can just like give money to people, and then they can use this money to buy the goods because the goods are very cheap. The big problem with giving money to people is if goods are scarce, then if you give the same amount of money to everybody, you don't change anything because it just raises the price of goods. You can think of, for example, a Harvard education or like really good healthcare or anything where like there's scarce resources. If you just said every American gets like $1,200 per month, then the prices of those things would just increase. But if it's goods that can just be produced as much as we want with from a factory that's fueled by energy and robots, then maybe it could work. Just give people money. So that's kind of the utopian view. The very pessimistic view basically says, look, if you start giving people money, it basically removes all incentives from them to be productive. And income inequality basically just means that some people are better than others in creating things, and making things. And so the solution to inequality is to basically train people and educate people so they can be more productive instead of just giving them money to not do anything. So those are the two camps that think about how to solve the inequality. I have to say, I was a firm believer in one of the two camps, but the more I read about this, the less I have conviction that one is better than the other. Like, I actually don't know. Especially if you can, food is very cheap to produce nowadays. Um, because fertilizers are mostly a function of energy. It's an intensive thing to do, and then land is pretty much a function of energy because like the U.S. doesn't have a shortage of land. It's just a matter of like transporting things from one place to another. So who knows? Maybe we could give a check to everybody and then just have machines do the rest. I really don't know. Do you have any view on that issue?
Well, I want to hear just really quickly which camp were you in before and which camp are you gravitating towards now?
So before I was firmly in the camp that said like you cannot give money to people because it will just like they will sit at home and play video games all day instead of just retraining to be you have many professions that where you have a shortage of people, like for example daycare in San Francisco, there's a shortage of daycare, or like taking care of old people, or like professions where people don't necessarily want to do them. And so like if you give them a check, they'll just stay at home. If you don't give them a check, they will go into these professions. um, so that was my previous camp, but now I'm thinking maybe you can just give people money and then they can retrain to do what they really want to do, because basically the universal basic income will not let you live like a luxurious life. Like
Yeah.
that's consensus. So the proponents of universal basic income say, look, maybe you want to be like you want to learn something that takes like many years to train for, and so if you just pay someone to live at home and then they can train over the internet, um, maybe over the long term it will make them even more productive. So I'm actually kind of on the fence.
Yeah, so I think it's important for our listeners. I hear that you're on the fence. So there's an element of socialism in every modern democracy. I mean, ultimately, public schools, libraries, any kind of public park, public goods, public lands is socialism, right? You're paying taxes, and taxes are going to taking care of various needs. I am all for that. And I do believe that we need these and we need these fabrics of society because I do believe that a strong society, even for the economy, a strong economical society, needs to have a good societal identity. You need to provide for people. I'm a parent, and raising kids in this country is extremely tough. We're not friendly for that, for working mothers at all. We're not friendly to working parents at all. It's very hard. So, in order for us, as an example, to have more productivity from parents, we can provide more social services for them. So, I'm all for socialism in that way of having social services. I'm completely against, though, universal basic income, and we can go into that, later. But I don't believe that handing out a check to a person and letting the person do whatever they want with it will help and cause any kind of productivity gains. I think giving a person training in jobs would. Giving a person a check, they're just going to spend it on whatever it is they're going to spend it on. And again, this to me, this is the part of the experiment that's failed over and over and over. So,
Sorry, can you just elaborate because this is very interesting. Why do you think this has failed over and over again?
well, because it's failed in the USSR, it's failed in every.
There they weren't given checks. There they were given a very basic, very small salary, and like everything was subsidized.
Yeah, you
So I
weren't
don't
given.
think the USSR ever tried to have a free market where you can import goods from all over the world and just giving people checks. This has actually never been tried.
So, but my so fair enough. But my argument against this is not necessarily in the method of payment or what the payment is, whether it's a check of money or it's low salaries and subsidize everything else. Ultimately, just like we talked about 2 podcasts ago, a government intervention, for example, is a tax. It's not just what you're getting taxed on. In this case, a check can be taken in different forms. My argument against this is that human nature says I'm going to take something that's given to me and I'm going to use it in a way that has the least amount of barriers. So in the most efficient way to me, that which means just spend it instead of exerting work to learn and to do something. And this has been proven over and over again. So I think what's going to happen with universal basic income is that we're going to give everyone a certain check, whether it's $100 a month or $3,000 a month, whatever it is. It doesn't really matter the amount. Whatever the amount is, the majority of the people are going to spend it for the lowest hanging fruit items instead of thinking about how to invest it or how to get education with it and what to do with it. And then they're going to be running out of money again. And then they're going to go to, let's say, a hospital and need to get served, which is going to come out of more taxpayer money, right? So they're not going to train themselves. And by the way, there's evidence to this. A great piece of evidence here, I don't remember the exact statistic, but I think something like 60 to 70% of Americans have less than $600 saved up today, right? People, and we've been beating the drum about savings for decades. It's been beaten to me in high school, in college. I know there's financial literacy and education courses out there. If one thing America talks about is save and invest, save and invest, save and invest. And still 60 to 70% of the people have no savings to live on. And so the point here is that the American public and our culture in America is a very consumer driven culture. We take and we spend. And this is why our economy is strong. But this is also why we have so much inequality. And I don't believe that in the US, you can give a check to somebody and say, hey, with this one, actually don't spend it. It's counter to our culture. We're an individualistic, consumer based, spending based society. And that's just our culture. It's not going to change.
So here I will completely disagree with you, and it's good because like we've been agreeing too much for for the last half hour. So, couple of things. First of all, the statistic that you mentioned is completely misleading. I'm not saying it's not true. I've heard it too. That like, what did you say? 60% of Americans don't have
Something along
like
those lines, yeah.
Okay, so I just Googled the percent of home ownership in the US and it's 67.4%. So 67.4% of people own a home. When people say they don't have money, it just means that they put it in their 401k and their mortgage. So it means they don't have cash money, but it doesn't mean that they can't, like, leverage other assets to get money. So like we're definitely, a society that leverages itself and goes into a lot of debt to buy homes, to, do all of these things. But so first of all, let's set the record straight. Then the second thing I want to say is, like, if the government intervenes, I think it's much better for it to give the money to people, because otherwise government bureaucrats have to decide where this money goes to. And like, you look at something like the student loan crisis, right? Like if the government says, oh, I'm going to subsidize higher education, because like if I just gave that amount of money to people, they would choose to not go to higher education. That just inflates the prices of higher education. If instead the government would have taken exactly the money that it spends on subsidizing higher education and just like given it to people in cash, like the same amount of money, just like equally divided by people, actually, I would argue it would benefit the poor people much more, because currently you have to go to college to get access to these funds. And like if you're poor and you don't go to college, you don't get these funds. So I am a big believer of direct support as opposed to the government picking winners and losers. But my last point on that is that maybe this whole argument between us is not going to be relevant, because with central bank digital currencies, which is something that is coming, you would do exactly what you could do exactly what you're suggesting, which is like give people a $1,200 check and say, look, you can spend it, but not on like booze and cigarettes. You can only spend it on certain things, but then still let the consumer choose, which I would say it's kind of the best of both worlds. Like if you had to choose how to give money to the people, probably central bank digital currencies is better. But it doesn't exist yet, but I think it will happen in the 20s.
So we should come back to 1920s versus the 2020s. But since you called me out, let me come back to you on this. Yes, home ownership in the US is high. And just to make the statistic uh, right, it's 70% own less than $1,000. The point is not whether people own homes. Many people, like you said, overextend themselves and are unable to buy a house. And I don't know the statistic for the actual average home equity. Maybe we can look it up. Maybe you can look it up while I'm talking about this, but it'll be interesting. The point is that when you have less than $1,000 saved in the bank, that's, and by the way, I just did a quick look. Home equity's been falling. It's about $100,000. We need to look at the price of homes and so on and so forth. But your liquid savings, liquid being something you can use today. And I know you're going to come back and say, well, you can get a home equity loan and blah, blah, blah. You can. That takes time. For something that you need to use today and for an emergency, people don't have money to do so. And it's because we are a capital driven, consumer spending driven society. And culture matters. If we were in Europe, if we were in Switzerland, or if we were in Singapore, or even if we were in Brazil, where it's mandated by the government to put certain money, the corporations put certain money in your retirement accounts, it will be a different story. But we're in the US, which is spending heavy. By the way, here's another statistic for you, or another scenario for you. If a person right now has an emergency health situation and they don't have good health insurance or they're unemployed, they are screwed. 50% of the bankruptcies in the US happened before Obamacare happened because of Medicare. Excuse me, because of medical costs. And so people don't have money, Shimon, for certain basic life emergencies. And again, because of our culture. And I have zero belief that now that we're going to give them, some sort of check and saying, hey, you know what, we're not going to tell you what to do, small government, you go spend it, but here's a check and here's a direct contribution, go spend it on something. They're going to go and spend it, quote unquote, wisely. In fact, the reason why these direct stimuluses work in general, especially in big amounts, is because people take that money and after they've paid off the bills that they need to pay off, and not even credit card bills, they go on and spend it. You look at the average American credit card debt. Let's look at that. I don't know the statistic, but it's massive.
I think we have totally made the point, and we can let our listeners decide on that. I still disagree with you, but we should probably make an episode about that. But that was kind of a side point of like how to solve income inequality. So how about we move to some of the things that are very different between the 1920s and the 2020s, and then we can close with our investment recommendations in
Let's do
light
it.
of the Roaring Twenties. So I thought of two things that are very different. One, 1920s, you got World War II as a result, and now a lot of the world has atomic weapons, which means that we will not have another bloody war. I'm willing to bet literally my life on it, which is like there may be small skirmishes, there may be like tensions, there may be like things like you had now between like, Turkey and Armenia, but the US and China are not going to fight like Germany and Russia did. Like it's just not going to happen. And that is actually a very good thing because it means that, you know, war, basically bloody war, will not be the result, no matter how much governments screw up, I think. And they can screw up really badly, and we can get into some of the kind of apocalyptic scenarios of like complete crash that some of the podcasts and and people I follow are talking about. Like a complete erasure of debt and like debt jubilees and like bankruptcies all around. I don't think it will, result in 50 million dead like World War II. So that's like one difference. The other difference is technology. So, as much as the technological boom was big in the 1920s, and it was big, like literally people were telephoning their stockbrokers to place orders in 1920, which was something unheard of before that. I think our technology now is much, much, much more advanced and advancing much more quickly. Like if we think of like all the life sciences advancement, CRISPR for gene editing, like we just developed a vaccine for a pandemic within less than a year. Like stuff like this has never happened before, and like all the molecular how do you call this, the nanotechnology, material. There's so much happening that I think we're on the cusp of just a huge technological boom, which can solve many of the problems that we mentioned, right? Because like if you get enough growth, enough real growth, then all of the problems that we mentioned, like income inequality, no problem, just tax the rich at 80%, and with like enough economic growth, it generates enough money for the ones that are less wealthy, and they can either retrain or they can do whatever. So those are the two main differences that I thought of. What do you think of those, or do you think of any other differences?
Yeah, look, I agree with those two. I completely agree. I think there are two other differences. One is Bitcoin. I know we mentioned this on every podcast, but it's important. And Bitcoin, regardless of the price, allows you to be able to move wealth cross borders. That's the main fundamental benefit of Bitcoin. You can buy it. Governments can't really confiscate it from you. You can claim to have lost your private keys or your password, travel abroad, go into an internet cafe, and get your Bitcoin back and be able to spend it and convert it to a local currency if you'd like and use it for whatever. I think that's an extremely powerful innovation. And the other is, well, liquor is legal now, so we can just drink our miseries away where we couldn't do in the 1920s.
Not only liquor.
That's right.
Yeah.
Everything is becoming illegal now. So you can drink, smoke, and I don't know, other things. Your miseries away. Versus in the 1920s, you were left with meditation and more holistic remedies. I'm kidding, of course, but I think I love the 3 points. Technology, completely. Nuclear weapons, of course, it will help prevent wars, the deterrent. And I do think Bitcoin, and I know you believe in this too, gives you an ability to move your wealth across and really protect your wealth in a system that's outside of government control, or mostly outside of government control. The government can just confiscate away from you, and that is a very, very powerful, very, very powerful motivator. In fact, as you and I talk most often, and we should get to our predictions, is that if the world goes to hell, so to speak, and everything starts breaking apart, Bitcoin will only become more powerful because that will be the ultimate safe haven, that where you can move your money, move your wealth. And unlike gold, it's very easy to transport across borders. You don't have to carry bags of gold and bullions, across from U.S. to Canada or U.S. to Mexico and fly with this. You actually just have digital gold. It's in any computer. It's accessible.
Yeah, I think that the point that you mentioned is really underrated. So many people talk about the fact that, oh, like, gold, you could like bury it in your backyard. And it's true. When FDR basically made gold illegal, they didn't confiscate gold from people's houses. They basically took over the gold that was stored in vaults and then, devalued it to prevent people from storing their value in it. Now, what's really powerful about Bitcoin is A, you don't have to put it in a vault because it's easy to store. And so with gold, like if you put it in your backyard, people could find it and just like steal it from you. But also the cross-border aspect has like two very important implications. One is what you mentioned, that you as a person can just like move out and take your wealth with you. But with gold, like other jurisdictions didn't have any incentive to like break from the consensus and offer like really good treatment for people, because they knew that those people can't come there with their gold because they would have been stopped at the border in the country from where they came. You have many people that escaped Russia, and um and just like with just the clothes on their back, because like they couldn't take any of their wealth with them in the Bolshevik Revolution. And so the fact that if something happens, and let's say you see it in Argentina now, where there's capital controls, right? And I'm not talking about Venezuela, I'm talking about Argentina, which is an amazing country. I love Argentina. The food is amazing, the people are amazing. But just the government said, look, if you get a wire, we automatically convert it into pesos at our rate, at the government rate. Like there's no such thing as like holding dollars. And so let's say you're an Argentinian, you have absolutely no way of taking your wealth unless you have Bitcoin, and then you go to Miami. And if Miami does the same thing, you can go. There's so many islands, that basically will give you a passport for like $100,000. And so this is like a huge incentive for government. And then in a game theory, by the way, because the governments know that the rich people can escape with their value, it actually prevents them from putting capital controls. Like they understand that like as soon as they start putting capital controls, a lot of the capital will flee. And in a sense, we're seeing this in the US, right? With like people leaving California because like the taxes there are so crazy and they're like, wait, I can live in Austin or I can live in like Florida and like get better treatment. So on the world scale, I think that's a big check on the governments. And so that's a huge point. And that's, I think, no matter what, Bitcoin is going to perform very, very well over the next 10 years because I believe that the government will continue printing money in order to solve income inequality. And by the way, whether you take the pessimistic or optimistic view of giving money to people, it doesn't matter because the solution is government printing money, right? Like they can't give money to people without printing it first. So like whether they subsidize programs or give it directly to people, they have to like, print money. And so Bitcoin will do extremely well over the next 10 years, I think.
So let me tell you and our listeners a quick anecdote about this. Actually, you're talking about carrying money across borders. This actually happened to me when I was a young child. My family and I were leaving the USSR, the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had a restriction of 2 bags per person that you were able to carry out of the country. So imagine leaving with your whole life, livelihood, and everything, and you have 2 suitcases per person. That's the only thing you can bring. And my grandpa had this amazing collection of Russian silver dollars. I'm not sure if it's really worth anything now, but it was a memento that he collected throughout his whole life, and it just wouldn't fit anywhere. And obviously, you couldn't carry money out. And for him, it had more sentimental value than anything else. So I literally remember, I think it was in Germany, at the airport. He didn't know where to put it, or maybe it was in the Moscow airport. I don't remember exactly where. But I was a little kid, and he put this whole collection in my pockets of my pants. And I remember we were going through the metal detectors, and my pants were kind of falling off because all the coins were weighing this down. And the metal detector, of course, goes off. And the security. This is back in the early '90s, and so looks at me and kind of quizzically, and I was a kid, I had a belt, and he just let me through. But I smuggled out, I don't remember how many rubles. I'm not sure if it's again worth anything, but it was just the idea of smuggling out any kind of metal money out of a country was so kind of risky and so hard to do that even smuggling out a small collection of silver rubles was so hard. But it actually happened to me. This story of traveling with kind of gold bullions, actually, or money, actually happened. But I do want to close off. I want to hear your perspective on whether the 2020s will end up the way the 1920s were. And let me tell you mine first, and then let's hear yours, and then we can let the listeners decide which way it's going to go. For me, I do think we're in a much better shape. We talked about the fact that there's a major crisis, and this crisis seems to be passing, especially with the vaccine. We talked about the stock market going up, and as our listeners who have listened to previous podcasts, both you and I agree and believe that our stock market will keep on going up. But there's a lot more resilience in the current U.S. financial system than there was in the 1920s. We talked about how technology plays a major role here, as do nuclear weapons and as does Bitcoin. My biggest concern is the social unrest. And I do think that we need to have a stable U.S. global power, global government. So not burn the system down, but someone that's more stable. Thankfully, Biden, Trump is out, but it doesn't matter if they're Republican or Democrat, just a stable figurehead that keeps the U.S. as the center of the economic and free world, if you will, where in a case of a crisis, the dollars or the money will come home. Well, there'll be a flight for safety back to the US and invest in the US market. So it's bad everywhere, but it's the least bad in the US. As long as we keep that status, I think we'll be fine. But I am nervous about the social unrest, and I'm nervous about that spilling over. What about you, Shimon?
Yeah, before I tell you what I think, I just want to clarify. When you say nervous, can you put it in like numerical terms? Like, what do you think would be the outcome? So, do you think the stock market will just keep climbing without any big, dips, or do you think the social unrest will result in some crisis?
I think I don't can't tell you numbers, but I can tell you I think it'll climb, climb, climb in maybe 5 to 7 years if we haven't solved if we keep on having the same marginalization that we have political marginalization and extremism. I think we're about to see some sort of pop of the bubble because something is going to have to give. We can't keep on having social protests, people feeling marginalized and disenfranchised from the system, voters feeling disenfranchised, this tear of democracy, this assault on the rule of law that we've had, this assault on free elections that we've had without consequences. And if it doesn't calm down, I do think, in 5, 7, 8 years, we're going to come to some sort of, this all is going to come to a boil. And that's what I'm afraid of.
Yeah, so I don't think I'm actually really not worried about social unrest, only as far as it relates to the stock market, because I think that the social unrest that we're seeing currently is nothing compared to like the Vietnam War or like the civil rights movement. Those were much bigger issues. So I think that because of technology and because we're making such progress, we will basically keep going up. Now, one thing that I really, really recommend our listeners to do, and I'm not a financial advisor, so please take this for entertainment purposes only. I would not be surprised if we get a dip of 40%, even multiple dips of 40%. But it's very, very different from what happened in 1929. Like in 1929, you got a dip of I don't know how much, 60% or something, and then it stayed down for many years. And I think because of all the factors that we mentioned, the fact that the government can print money, the fact that the government is willing to intervene in the markets, the fact that like technology is deflationary, and so like you can dump a lot of money on the market, and this doesn't create a huge increase in the basic needs, which is what creates social unrest. So like, people need to be fed and have to have a roof over their head. And I think that if you can survive, if your portfolio can survive dips of 40 or 50%, you can expect them to recover really quickly. And so I would really suggest, I mean, not suggest, if this happens again, I was very sad that I didn't have any liquid money in the dip that happened in March, because I knew that both Bitcoin and the stock market would recover violently, but it's just I didn't have any free cash to invest. So I think every time a dip happens, it will rebound. And I think that social unrest, while it may manifest like on the streets, I don't think it will have any kind of long lasting effect on the stock market. Now, this is just, we're talking about the US. Like if you're living in Turkey, things may be very different, right? Like I'm just talking about the US. I don't know too much about other countries. I know a little bit about Israel. Same thing happened in Israel. Coronavirus hit, the government just printed a lot of money. It didn't create inflation, but that's because they discovered a lot of gas. So they basically like gave up future revenues to give cash to people right now. So as long as we're talking about an economy that's kind of stable and has a lot of assets and has a lot of human capital, I think that we're just headed straight up. But very, very important to not leverage yourself in a way that a 40 or 50% dip blows up your portfolio. That's what I think will happen going forward.
Yeah, so just I did a quick lookup for our listeners. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is not a great indicator today, but it was a great indicator back then, went from about 5,000 in 1929 to about 900 in 1931, and then went back up by 1937. So, like
So
you said,
that's like 9 years, that yeah,
yeah,
or 8 years
it
into
was an
2027.
impressive fall. So I think we'll wrap one word 2020 better outlook, more optimistic or less optimistic than 1920s, Shimon?
Much better
Perfect.
because of all the factors that we mentioned.
I think it's much better too. And I think with this, this is thank you for listening for the Hardcore Finance podcast. This is Alex Chiswick at Mr. EBITDA.
And this is Shimon Lazarov at Shimon Lazarov. Thank you so much for listening to us. Please keep hitting us up with suggestions and comments, and leave a review and rating. This really helps us getting on top of those algorithms. We're already seeing a lot of organic traffic and we're just getting started. So we really appreciate your support.